Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you this morning. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to share some of my work on sustainability and social responsibility. So I'm a strategy scholar. I've been looking at the issue of how do companies integrate environmental and social issues into the way they do business, and what are the implications of doing so. So I wanted to share with you in the next 15 minutes that we have together some of the learnings that I derived through my work to date. So let me start by saying that there's no question that companies around the world are feeling the pressure to be environmentally more responsible, to act with integrity, to take care of their supply chains, in general, to really care about the social and environmental context in which they function. And these pressures have manifested in many, many different ways. A very important one is the generational shift. Millennials and younger generations are putting enormous pressures on companies to behave in a more responsible way. Think about millennials as consumers that demand better products, more ethically and more environmentally responsible products. Think about millennials as employees that demand that the companies that they work for behave more ethically and with purpose. And finally, think about millennials as savers, as investors. We know that there's going to be a huge intergenerational transfer of wealth from the baby boomers to millennials in the upcoming decade. So as investors, millennials are also asking that their money is invested in a way that is ethically, environmentally, and socially responsible. So all of these pressures, and that, by the way, also includes government regulation, investor pressure, consumer demand, and so on. All of these pressures are in recent years creating the perfect storm for companies. They're feeling the pressure for a new model of corporate leadership. What does that mean? I think, in my view, companies are facing a huge wave of disruption. As a matter of fact, sustainability is the mother of all disruption. Why is that the case? Because most companies are missing the knowledge, the skills, and the experience that is needed in order to truly engage with environmental and social issues. And what happens in disruptions? We know that there's two ways forward. First of all, some companies may try to adapt to this new competitive landscape, but also it might well be the case that some companies are actually going to be replaced by innovative entrepreneurial ventures. Think about Tesla in the automobile industry. Think about companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat in the food industry. Because of the demands for a plant-based diet, they came in and they're already displacing consumption of meat. So this is a huge dilemma, and we need to understand that sustainability is something very, very difficult, exactly because it is disruption. You'll hear a lot of people out there saying, oh, sustainability, it's about, finding a stakeholder, holding hands, dancing kumbaya, and the world is going to be a better place. That's not the case. There's no free lunch out there. What is important to keep in mind is that if you want to do sustainability right, it's about integrating these environmental and social issues at the center of the business model, at the center of the strategy, not at the periphery, not what you do as philanthropy on a Friday afternoon, but rather how you create value as a business. So companies that do commit to sustainability face very important trade-offs because let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, sometimes environmentally responsible materials might be more expensive, so you have increased costs. And then the question becomes, will you be able to command a higher willingness to pay? Sometimes sustainability is a long-term strategy, and companies are facing short-term investors that demand quarterly returns as opposed to a long-term return. There's many other instances where a true commitment, and only when if it's true, but a true commitment to sustainability creates these trade-offs. So that is exactly why sustainability, in my view, it's fundamentally a strategic problem. Because if we think about companies moving beyond legal requirements, beyond what the law tells them to do on these issues, then it is a matter of strategic choice. How much should I stick my head out? Should I just adopt an environmental management system, or should I be a proponent? Should I be an advocate for climate change solutions, for instance? So you see, there's a huge spectrum, and the decision on how much you're going to invest in this essentially becomes a strategic decision. Now, we know and we already understand how is it that companies are making these decisions. Why is it the case that in the same companies in the same industry, when they're faced with the same issue, let's say all of the car industries, of the car companies are facing pressures to respond to climate change. Why is it the case that some of them respond in so many different ways? Well, the key here is to understanding what is their decision-making process. And what we know is that there's two mechanisms that executives need to keep in mind when they decide about sustainability. First of all, it's the willingness of the organization. In other words, how close is the issue to the values, the culture, the norms, the identity of the organization? Is this an issue with which the organization can actually resonate? But that's not enough. That's only the willingness of the organization. What executives also need to look at is the cost-benefit analysis, the ability of an organization to respond. Do we have what it takes? In other words, do we have the necessary resources to respond, and can we mobilize them? So the decision-making process, a deep decision-making process on sustainability, has to count both the willingness as well as the ability of organizations to respond to a particular issue. Now, I have talked extensively about sustainability as a strategy, and because I see sustainability as a strategy, that generates three very important questions that I would like to address with you. First of all, well, if it's a strategy, is it a good one? In other words, is sustainability a profitable strategy? Second, well, even if it's a profitable strategy, how does it happen? How do I go from a commitment to sustainability to actual outperformance? And finally, how can I make sure that sustainability is not just the personal crusade of a CEO or the top executives, but how is it really embedded into the organizational DNA? So these are the three questions that I would like to address for the remaining of my talk. So first of all, we know from a lot of academic research to date, data sets that span many industries, a lot of across time and across countries and so on, we know and we have been able to show that sustainability is a profitable strategy. In other words, companies that truly commit, and notice, I mean truly commit. I don't take into account here greenwashing or box ticking approaches to sustainability. I'm talking about true integration of sustainability. So those companies that truly commit actually outperform in the longer term. And we have evidence that this outperformance is both in operational performance as well as stock market performance, because of course increasingly capital markets are demanding and are looking and are checking how a company is integrating environmental and social issues. So the second question then is, well, if it's profitable, how does it happen? And here we have a lot of research that goes into the mechanisms through which a commitment to sustainability leads to better performance. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have evidence that companies that commit to sustainability are able to better engage, recruit, and retain their employees. So sustainability can create value by providing you with preferential, superior access to human capital. We also have evidence that sustainability generates actually better access to finance. We know, for example, that companies that are more sustainable face lower capital constraints. We know that they're being rewarded by the markets. We know that investment analysts increasingly have more positive recommendations for companies that are engaged in sustainability. Now, I mentioned at least two mechanisms to you. I mentioned the financial markets. I mentioned the human capital. There's also a lot to be said on the consumer side. Ethical consumerism is on the rise. Sustainable companies are better able to identify, build a long-term relationship with their customers, and therefore better reputation and brand loyalty. And I'm going to finish with one very important mechanism, and that's innovation. We know and we have the evidence that companies that commit to sustainability are more innovative because they produce more and more patents and more highly cited patents. Why is that the case? Well, very, very briefly, think about it. What are the components of a successful innovation process? Well, you need preferential access to human capital, which you can get through sustainability. You need a long-term time horizon. You cannot just tell people, I want you to innovate and I want you to innovate by tomorrow. So a long-term time horizon, which is totally aligned with the sustainability strategy. Tolerance for failure, in other words, a true commitment towards your employees, an authentic relationship and not a transactional relationship. And therefore, how could you possibly expect to innovate unless you tolerate failure? So a true commitment when you say that we tolerate failure, and in fact, we encourage our employees to experiment. And finally, you need a target. You need an objective. Nobody is innovating by sitting at the comfort of their couch. So the best of leaders take those sustainability trade-offs and they turn them on their head. They throw them back to the organization and they tell them that, look, this is the objective. This is our moonshot opportunity. They don't just see the problem like many companies do and say, oh, my customers are not going to buy it. Oh, I don't know how to do this and so on. Those are not the innovative companies. You have to attack those trade-offs head on. And the winners in the sustainability space are the ones that are really able to resolve those trade-offs through innovation. So many ways through which sustainability can actually create value, whether it's through customers, employees, the social license to operate, through finance, through innovation, through brand loyalty, and many others that all of them we're currently researching to understand more. Now, let me get to the third and final question for today. How do we embed sustainability into the corporate DNA? Because many companies out there say, oh, sustainability is in our DNA. What does that mean? So in my work, I have identified 4 pillars through which sustainability can be embedded in the organization: corporate governance, stakeholder engagement, transparency and accountability, and long-term time horizon. Let me briefly touch on all these 4. Corporate governance. Sustainability has to be a commitment for the top. You need a board with a formal sustainability committee. You need a board-level subcommittee that oversees sustainability. And also, you need to include sustainability or ESG metrics into your incentives and compensation. You cannot say, I want to be a sustainable business, but suddenly you incentivize everybody with quarterly sales. It's not going to happen. So you need to use those tools of the organization and try to integrate sustainability into incentives and structures. Second, stakeholder engagement. It is very important for organizations that really want to be sustainable to look at the relationships with their stakeholders as assets, as intangible assets. And assets need time, effort, and investment. Perhaps it's a stakeholder dialogue, an ongoing dialogue. Perhaps it's a stakeholder mapping. Perhaps it's about treating the firm as an open system. Now, most companies don't do that. Most companies, because they, still think that their only responsibility is to shareholders, they treat employees, suppliers, customers as transactions. And they're not transactions if you do it right. They're actually assets. And that's the whole mind shift that is required to go from shareholder primacy to a stakeholder model. Third, the time horizon for decision making. If you're a sustainable business, you need to be long-term. What does that mean? It means that the long-term time horizon needs to be reflected in your decisions. How do you choose projects? How do you allocate capital? How do you personally make decisions as a CEO? What time horizon are you taking into account? And finally, transparency and accountability. We know that sustainable companies, those that do have sustainability into their DNA, they also disclose more. They measure not only financials, but also non-financial metrics. They have higher level of information and better quality of information, which they disclose. And at the same time, on the accountability front, they make sure that accountability goes beyond the walls of their own business. And how do they do that? Maybe some of them will advocate. Others might actually adopt environmental and social standards in terms of how they choose their supply chain partners, especially if you're a big business. This is a domain that you can have a huge impact, because if you could say, for instance, if you want to be in our supply chain, you need to commit, for example, to net zero. Because if you don't commit, then as a big business, we're not going to work with you. So you see how that generates accountability outside the business. So I have addressed with you today 3 important questions. First of all, whether sustainability is a good strategy. Second of all, if it's a good strategy, how does it pay off? And if we are serious about sustainability, how can we embed it into the corporate DNA? If you put the answers to those 3 questions together, I hope that you can see that sustainability is the disruption of our time, because it is going to be very difficult. And disruptions are always difficult for companies. Think about the corporate graveyard is packed with once iconic brands like Kodak, Polaroid, Blockbuster, and so on. Companies that failed to manage through transitions because they were too arrogant, too complacent, or because they were ignoring the underlying problem. I urge you to start thinking sustainability as a disruption today, to start making those necessary investments to make your companies and your organizations future-proof, because the competitive landscape is changing very, very, very rapidly. These environmental and social pressures are not only here to stay, but they're actually going to worsen. And we know that they're becoming more pressing and they're deteriorating. So the time to act is now, in terms of getting on the journey to really build a sustainable enterprise model. And who knows, if we all do this, and if we are able to generate sustainable enterprises at the economy level, then we might actually have a fighting chance against the world's most pressing global challenges, like climate change, the loss of biodiversity, social inequalities, poverty, and so many challenges that we all need to address collectively and urgently. So thank you so much for your attention this morning.